Good afternoon, everyone. We begin our study today in the book of Exodus. So, by way of introduction, we have come to know this book as the book of Exodus, given the Greek name, but the Hebrew name is somewhat different. The Hebrew name comes from this word here, and this word is Shemot, and it means the names, means the names. So Shemot would be the names, and that's how this book is referred to in the Hebrew name as it is. So quite different from how we actually are familiar with the name. But we will still use the name Exodus as we begin our study because that is how we would reference this particular book. Now, in order for us to understand, by way of introduction to the book of Exodus, we really need to understand where we came from. So, at the end of the book of Genesis, we have the families of Jacob entering into Egypt and lived there for a fair number of years. And so, by way of introduction, it may be useful for us now to actually look at some of the more pertinent Bible verses so that it would help us understand and put all this introduction into some form of context. So, allow me here to show you. We begin with Genesis chapter 15. In Genesis chapter 15, we read from verse 13. Now, verse 13 tells us this. Then God said to Avram, know for certain that your descendants or your seeds will be strangers in the land. Strangers means it's not their land. They happen to be there. That is not theirs. This would reference the fact that the place where Abraham is actually standing on would be his place, but the descendants would not be there, but they would be somewhere else. And they will be enslaved and oppressed. And the expression here, it doesn't say for 400 years, it basically says 400 years, right? That's all it says. They will be, and this whole expression, being strangers in a land where they will be enslaved, oppressed, there is a period of 400 years. Now, for our purpose of context, now we need to remember later on in the book of Exodus, we also know that they will be leaving the land. There is a lot of events that happens when they leave the land. So God says, I will also judge the nation. And for our purposes today, that nation will be Egypt, whom they will serve. And afterward, they will come out with many possessions. So bear this in mind that the children of Israel will come out of Egypt rich. Verse 16 tells us, and then in the fourth generation, they will return here for the wrongdoing or the sins of the Amorite is not yet complete. God is giving the Amorites some few hundred years to come to terms with God. Now that we're in the book of Exodus, we will eventually find out that the Amorites didn't do anything about their sins against God. Now we need to think about the fourth generation. So let me explain a little bit about the fourth generation. We have at this point in time Abraham. And by his fourth generation, you will understand that there is Isaac. Then there is Jacob, and his other name is Israel. Then Jacob has 12 sons. And when they came into Egypt, Jacob and the 12 sons and the sons of the 12 sons, which are his grandchildren, also entered into Egypt. And so now we have four generations of people. And these four generations of people will leave. And so by leaving, we are now talking about this generation then. We have A, at this point in time, we have the 20 years and above. And then we have below 20 years. We need to remember that at this point in time, the fourth generation going in was supposed to be this generation. But later, when we go into the book of Numbers, you will find that that generation didn't want to go in Numbers chapter 13 and 14. And so they were left to die in the wilderness, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb. And eventually, who actually entered into the promised land will be seen. This will be those born in the wilderness. And so now I just hope that we get a little bit more context that only these two generations went into the promised land. And so the original intent was for the fourth generation, but it didn't quite occur because while they were supposed to, they eventually rejected that option for them. And so we are now coming into the book of Exodus with this at the back of our minds. With 400 years since Genesis chapter 15, I just want us, by way of introduction, remember that the years of oppression is not the entire 400, but for a shorter period of time. Verse 1. Verse 1 says, and these are the names of the sons of Israel. And by sons of Israel, you should also read the sons of Jacob, who came to Egypt with Jacob. These are the sons of Jacob who came with their father. They came each one with his household. You can actually read this in Genesis chapter 46. And in chapter 46, you will find the count of the household. We are now told that we have Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Yehuda, Issachar, Zebulun, Binyamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, and these are all their family members. And so we read in verse 5, all the people who descended from Jacob. And this idea of descended Jacob literally means who came out of his loins. Means these are directly descended. They are not adopted. They are not servants. They are not friends. These are really direct descendants. And this count came to this number here, 70 people. But Joseph was already in Egypt. Now we have this count in Genesis chapter 46 and in verse 27. there was supposed to be 66 people, and then we have Joseph and his two sons, and then plus Jacob, altogether 70 people in Egypt. Now, based on this count, I just want us to remember this is a refresh of Genesis chapter 46 by way of introduction to Exodus chapter 1. Why were they in Egypt? Number one, this would be in Genesis chapter 15. It was a promise for God to tell Abraham that for 400 years they cannot come back to this land, that this land would not be theirs until the sins of the Amorite has been accounted for. But they will be in a land that does not belong to them. They will be a stranger, and that will be in Egypt. That is why they went to Egypt. It was also because Joseph was there. As you begin to read towards the end of the book of Genesis, Joseph was sold into Egypt, eventually rose up to become the prime minister of Egypt. He was the Pharaoh's right hand man. Apart from Pharaoh, Joseph was the most powerful man, and he was able to interpret the Pharaoh's dream, spoke about seven fat cows and then seven lean cows. And he was the one who actually helped to make Egypt into a great empire. And during that time, we find that the family of Jacob went down in chapter 46 of the book of Genesis. And hence it fulfilled the fact that they are going to be strangers in a land that is not theirs. But they were happy in that land because they have things to eat. They were parked in a place called Goshen, and they were distinctly separated out because of their love for caring for the flock, the goats and the sheep. And they cannot be mixed up with the Egyptians because in the Egyptian culture, there is a goat like head god. Now, being in Egypt is important because the land of Canaan is very hostile. And every now and then they would have wars and they'll be fighting. Now, in order for the prophecy and the promise to Abraham to make him into a great nation to take place, a nation is not 70 people. A nation will be far, far more. And God promised Abraham that his descendants would be like the stars in the sky, which he cannot count, which will be like the sand on the shore, which he cannot count. And in order to get to that number, God brought them into Egypt so that for a number of years they will be under the protection of what we would call the most powerful nation on earth at that time. And under the guidance and protection of the Pharaoh with Joseph, and then we find that they grew in huge numbers. Now we continue into verse 6. Verse 6, it says here, and then. So remember these words. And then means after they went into Egypt, they grew and they fulfilled God's prophecy that they will be in the land where they will be strangers. And then Joseph died. All his brothers and all that generation. Now, what does that mean? It means that the generation of the sons, right? This would be the sons of Jacob, had all died, which leaves us with a fourth generation. Verse 7, but the sons of Israel were fruitful. That would be fertile. They had lots of fruits. And then they increased greatly. Now, this idea of increase greatly comes from a picture of swarming. When God created the sea creatures in the book of Genesis, chapter 1, it was describing swarms of little wriggly life. And so, this is the same word that is being used, that the, the, the way that they would look at the children of Israel at that time is that they are like swarms of little planktons running around in the land. And it says here the idea of multiply actually says that they became many, right? They became many. This is in terms of numbers, right? They became many. The final description was that they became exceedingly mighty. This word exceedingly mighty is I guess you can say that it is an emphasis of strength. An emphasis of strength, and strength not only by numbers, but strength by their collective ability to do things. And the final description is this. And this word here is not just so, this would be and then. As they grew in such numbers, you find that the land of Egypt was filled with them. And so the description of filled with them, you can actually understand this was full of them, which means that there is so many of the descendants of Jacob that verse 7 is given to us in such descriptive way of the fact that they were very fertile, meaning they could have many children, and which probably would be different from how the Egyptians might be. So it is an important description to contrast. They were like swarms, either swarms of flies or swarms of plankton, but large number all over the place. They multiplied, and this word would be many. There were so many of them, and they became very strong. And then the land was filled or full of them. Verse 8. Verse 8 tells us that now, and you could guess by now, this would be and then. After that description of how uh, at the time of Joseph, and then the people just got into such great numbers that is phenomenal. So verse 7 really gives us a glimpse of what happened in between Genesis and Exodus. However, in verse 8, and then a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Understand this. This is literally the word king, and it doesn't say Pharaoh. Pharaoh is a title. King is merely describing a person in a role who rules over Egypt. Now, by the way, Egypt is Mizraim, and there was a new king. A new king would be a pharaoh equivalent of that pharaoh title. And it says that he did not know Joseph. Now, understand that this idea of did not know means he did not have any experience, never seen Joseph, did not talk to him, did not know him in an experiential way. He must have known about Joseph, but never knew him in a personal way. Now, this is important because when there is a king over Egypt that doesn't know Joseph, nor whatever obligations the previous Pharaoh would have given to the children of Israel, he would know of the privileges, but he doesn't know of Joseph to treat the children of Israel in the same way. And that is the purpose of verse 8. As it progressed, verse 9 comes into play. This word is and then. So we are seeing a lot of narrative that's coming out. After this new king came to rule over Egypt, he said to his people, now we talk about his people, I think we can say that this would be his advisors or representative leaders. He says, behold, the people of the sons of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. So at this point in time, you should be able to deduce that Pharaoh didn't like the Israelites. They still weren't called the Israelites, they were called the sons of Israel because they came down with Jacob. They were called the Hebrew people because the nation of Israel has not been activated yet. So, by way of consistency, I guess, we should be able to call them as the Hebrew people. They are the sons of Israel, which would be Jacob. And they were too many in terms of numbers and too mighty in terms of strength. And so the Pharaoh just didn't like this threat. It is a threat to him. But understand this, why didn't the Pharaoh just kill them all? Why would the Pharaoh ever need to consult the people? Because that would be totally unjust. The Israelites had done nothing to warrant a massive killing, and the people would not be able to accept that. And so he talks to his people. He says, behold, these Hebrew children are just too many and too strong for us. Now, please watch the language in verse 10. He says, come, let us deal shrewdly with them. Otherwise, they will multiply, and in the event of war, they will also join with those who hate us and fight us. And now, this word is not depart from the land. Okay, so let me just strike that out first. Basically, it is telling us that Pharaoh is fearful of the Hebrew people. He needs to deal with them in a shrewd way, and this will be cunning. Please understand that this word comes from the root wise. And so I would prefer the word deal with them in a smart way, but in a negative sense, to ensure that the Pharaoh doesn't get a rebellion from his people. The Pharaoh is deciding that he will need to give, and this would deal is to give smartly or wisely in a negative way with them so that they they do not need to multiply. Now, Pharaoh doesn't want to see this number growing, and that's what he means. But otherwise, they will multiply, do nothing, and these Hebrew people will keep growing and growing and growing. And this was his fear, the fear that in the event of war, and those who hate the Egyptians come and fight the Egyptians, and this is what it means. He says, um, in verse 10, I think it is important for us to realize that they will join up, right? They are worried that the Hebrew people will join the enemies and attack them. And this is what the text says, from the land, not from outside, but from inside the land. Why? Because they were already there in Goshen. And so verse 10 is what we would call a national security concern by Pharaoh. That the Hebrew people have grown into such strength that by themselves they can't do much, but they can actually combine with enemies who would come and fight them, and they would be able to fight the Egyptians from inside the land, but the enemies would come from outside the land. And this really paints the Hebrew people into a real national security threat. So I want us to be mindful of such a word. Shrewd, it's cunning, is wise. It comes from the root, and it's about smartness, but in a negative way, right? In a negative way. Verse 11. And so with that in place, this will be, and then the Pharaoh had his way. He cannot just let them go. He cannot kill them. He need to deal with them in a very cunning way. And so they appointed chieftains, taskmasters over them to oppress them. Now, this idea of taskmasters would be chiefs. Okay, this idea is chiefs. Chiefs of labor. So we call them the taskmasters in English. And then oppress them. The idea of oppressing them is not so much as to hurt them. This word here, oppress them, is not so much as in hurting them, which it could, right? It could mean to afflict them. So let me just explain. There are two meanings here. The first meaning that you can understand is that this would be to humble them so that they do not come into a rebellious state. It will also mean to humiliate them. But the better way of looking at this is that they are to be occupied or kept busy. Now, what does that mean? When people are busy, they don't have time to think about disobedience and rebellion. And so this word oppress doesn't necessarily mean to hurt them, because by hurting them too much, they would actually react against the Pharaoh. And so The cunning way or the smart way of doing it is that they are kept so busy they have no time to act against the nation of Egypt. And they were put to hard labor. The word hard labor here is compulsory activities. It would be burdensome, burdensome work, something that will make them do heavy work. Now we read of this same concept in the book of First Kings. When Solomon was building the temple, he also had taskmasters over the foreigners who were there with them. And the foreigners did a lot of hard labor. This is that same concept. So it is not about mistreating the Israelites, although I must say that cannot be excluded. But the intent of showing us that the Pharaoh is trying to be very conniving, in a way, keeping them busy, in a way, putting enough pressure on them that they dare not go against the Pharaoh. Now, contrary to popular beliefs, you find that the idea here is, and then they built for Pharaoh storage places. This would be storehouses, and likely for the storehouses of grain, right? Storehouses, and there were two places. It's called Pitom and Ramesses, and these are not pyramids. And so, contrary to popular illustration, the Israelites or the Hebrew people were not put into forced labor to build pyramids. They were put into burdensome labor, being very busy with what they did, uh, and they were there to build storage facilities, right? Storage facilities. When we get to verse 12, the way that we read in verse 12 also tells us that, but the more they keep them busy or humble them, the more they multiplied and the more they spread out, so that they dreaded the sons of Israel. So understand, oppressed would be this. The more they multiplied, became many in number, and then the more they spread it out, it means that the more they burst out from Goshen, because Goshen was a place where they were dedicated to house them, but they were just too many. And then this word here, dreaded, the idea of dreaded, this word is so that is, and then they loathed, they were sickened, they loathed. And the idea here is they were disgusted. These were the strangers of the land, and they just gotten out of control. For the number of Hebrew people just kept growing. Now, that way of expression basically tells us that the Hebrew people outgrew the Egyptians. Verse 13. Verse 13 now tells us, and the Egyptians used violence to compel the sons of Israel to do work. Now, this idea of violence uh, is, I guess you can see this other meaning, right? Harshness, cruelty, severe or severity, apply a lot of rigor. Uh, and so I guess you could find that it is really to impose on them, and this is the eventual pain. So you notice that when they first began, it was not about inflicting pain. So this idea of violence isn't violence in terms of killing them, but it is violent in the sense of being more cruel to them to make the sons of Israel do work for them. And in this case, you find that it has moved from being busy to ultimately they are beginning to hate this working arrangement. Verse 14. And then, as they grew in number, the Egyptians made the lives of the Hebrew people, it says here, bitter. They really started to hate the life. As you can see, the life slowly but surely became worse and worse with hard labor and forced them to make mortar and bricks and all kinds of labor in the field to make bricks and mortar. And all their labors, they had actually cruelly, severely, harshly forced them to do. Now, this word here as slaves would be a bit of probably I wouldn't use that word to express. So let I think it would be they use crushing hardness to get them to perform. And so as slaves is I would say it's not in the Hebrew. It's added into interpret. So the translator had interpreted and given us a picture of slaves, but that is not how the Hebrew language expresses itself. They now have a hard life, and they were treated or mistreated in a severe way, right? In the severe way. Now, at this point in time, you should be able to see the progression from the Pharaoh trying to maneuver his way, being very smart, very cunning, in a negative way, to do so in a way where it slowly will, what we call, boil the frog. And so the Hebrew people began as being busy and then eventually being tormented and oppressed to force them to do work which they hated. And so now their lives were bitter. That would be how we would read from verses 1 to 14. It is a development, evolution, a progression. It was not there day one. Verse 15. And then, now that they were growing more and more and more, the king of Egypt, notice they don't use the word Pharaoh, this king who doesn't know Joseph, this is the king, spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom were named Shiphrah, and the other was named Puah. So there are two midwives. Now understand that these are Hebrew midwives, which means that the Hebrew women who were pregnant, when they give birth, they would have Hebrew midwives. However, notice this is the conniving of the king of Egypt. Number one, He is doing it in a smart, but in a negative, smart way. He doesn't want to be seen to orchestrate the reduction of Hebrew people, but it needs to be done. So he has a plan to reduce the Hebrew numbers. And the plan is hatched that there were male babies affected. And it is important for us then to realize that it has developed to a point where the king of Egypt just cannot handle the numbers that were growing. So his plan was this. He told the midwives, the Hebrew midwives, notice he's using the Hebrew people to reduce the Hebrew population. So when you're helping the Hebrew women to give birth, and you see them upon the birth stool about to give birth, and if the head pops out, if it's a son, you shall put him to death. Now, this is a very important uh, instruction, right? This is a very important instruction. You are to, well, we use a harder word here. You're supposed to kill him. Then it says here, but if it's a daughter, it's okay. She shall live. Now, one of the things that we find is this, but. This word, but, in verse 17 is, and then. As the midwives were receiving this instruction to do the awful task of reducing the number of Hebrew male babies, you find that the Pharaoh is actually hiding behind the midwives, not wanting to be seen to have a hand in killing them. But the midwives feared God. Now, this I think is important. The midwives feared God tells us this. If you let us read the whole thing, and did not do as the king of Egypt had commanded them, but let the boys live. So this is an A and a B. So what is an A and a B? Fearing God. So the midwives chose. So between God and Pharaoh, the midwives had decided to choose God. By choosing God, we are told that this is to fear God. So fear is not an internal thing, it is visible. And the visibility of fear is the choice of the midwives is to let the boys live. In other words, as we can see here, they disobeyed the king, but they obeyed God. So fear causes one to obey God, but on the other hand, disobey Pharaoh. You can't obey both. So you have to have one or the other, but by the fear of God, meaning the midwives fear God far more than Pharaoh. And so the midwives were named, right? This is Shifra and Puah. And they were named because the midwives displayed godly fear, to fear God in their actions, that they are not afraid to die, to disobey Pharaoh, but to maintain the sanctity of life of the Hebrew male children. Verse 18. And then, right? And then, when the king found out, the king called for the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing and let the boys live? I told you to kill them when it is boys. And so the midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife can get to them. Basically, they are saying that the Hebrew women gives birth far easier, faster. So before a midwife can arrive, they are already born. Now, what we have seen, as we can see the backstory here, is that the midwives basically allowed the male children to live. But technically speaking, in our modern day, uh, the midwife seems to have lied to Pharaoh. Now, understand this, in the Hebrew context, the Bible never once used the expression the midwives lied to Pharaoh. This is a modern construct, a modern understanding. In the ancient Hebrew understanding, you would find that the midwives protected the lives of the babies. And in so doing, whenever a life is at stake, misdirecting is not called deception, it is not called lies, and it is permissible. As you can tell in the book of Genesis, we have a few occasions when a life is at stake, particularly the lives of the people that God is protecting. And so, in this event, the midwives were named because they feared God. And in that fearing God, they had to disobey the Pharaoh. They also have to protect the lives of the babies. They also were there to protect their own lives. And so we have two counts here of lives that needs to be protected. Otherwise, more people will die and they are innocent. As we conclude into verses 20 to 22, you find that this word is and then. Because of the heroic actions of the midwives, God is said to be good. Now, understand the word good is tov. This would be functional to the midwives. In the eyes of the midwives, it is good to them. And whatever they did, the people grew to be many more and became very strong. Verse 21. And then, right? And then that the midwives actually feared God, he established households for them. Now, what does this mean? He established households means the midwives had families. By having families, this word basically tells us that she has a house, she has a man, the husband, and they have children. Understand that this way of expression is a blessing and it is good to the midwives. That's how it would be understood. Verse 22, our final verse. It says here, and then Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, and he made this as a command now. He himself got into the picture because he realized he cannot count on the midwives. Every son who is born, you are to throw into the Nile, but every daughter you are to keep alive. And so, by way of concluding, understand this. This becomes an edict, and the Egyptians went from door to door to look for a Hebrew son. Now, by way of concluding, we will get into chapter 2, and we have two children, Aaron and Moses. We know from Exodus chapter 7 and in verse 7, Aaron is 3 years older than Moses, which means that this particular command that Pharaoh instituted at the conclusion of Exodus chapter 1 had happened after Aaron was born, but before Moses was born. And that would be the way to understand chapter 1 going into chapter 2. That's why Aaron was not subjected to the search, but Moses was. And so when we get into chapter 2, please bear in mind Miriam, the elder sister, Aaron, the older brother of Moses, they were both already born before Moses came about. And with this, we come to the end of our session today.